Evet, değerli izleyiciler, hepinize hoş geldiniz diyorum. Ancak görüyorum ki halen gelenler var, katılımcılarımız halen geliyorlar. Bu nedenle sadece 1 ya da 2 dakika daha e, beklemenizi rica edeceğim. Yoğunluk olduğu için yavaş yavaş sayı artıyor. Evet, çok az kaldı. Ben katılımcı kayıt sayısını bildiğim için bekliyorum. Çünkü konuşma İngilizce olacağı için önceden bazı uyarılarda bulunmam lazım. Bütün konuşma aynı anda Türkçe'ye çevrilecek. Evet, halen geliyorlar. Evet. Fakat sanıyorum 3 dakika geçti. O zaman 1 dakika daha bekleyelim. 1 dakika sonra 1 dakika içinde başlayacağım. Evet, sanıyorum artık yavaş yavaş konferans salonumuz dolmaya başladı. Ben chatten bir bakıyorum önce bir problem var mı diye. Evet, bir problem yok. Benim sesimi zaten duyuyorsunuz. Evet, peki. O halde etkinliğimize başlayabiliriz. Şimdi değerli izleyiciler, tabii bu yeni bir Akmet konferansı. Ocak ayının 2. konferansı. Hepinize tekrar hoş geldiniz diyorum. Fakat öncelikle söylemem gereken bir şey var. Çünkü bir sorun yaşamanızı istemiyorum. Zoom ekranının alt kısmında sağ tarafta bir buton olacak. O butondan bir bakıyorum tekrar ismine, bir yanlışlık yapmayalım diye. Evet, orada Türkçe seçeneğini seçmeniz lazım. Yani interpreter diye bir buton var. Oradan Türkçe seçeneğini seçmeniz lazım eğer Türkçe izleyecekseniz. Bu çok önemli. Sanıyorum bir problem şu aşamada yoktur. İsteyenler de İngilizce seçeneğini seçebilirler. Evet, bugünkü konumuz Çatalhöyük. Konuşmacımız ise Hodder. Profesör Hodder uzun yıllar Çatalhöyük kazılarını yönetti. İnsanlık tarihi için önemli bulguların ortaya çıkmasını sağladı. Zaten Anadolu'daki Neolitik yerleşimlerden bahsedecek olursak sanırım Çatalhöyük'ü ilk sıralara koymamız gerekecek. Hodder Stanford Üniversitesi'nden emekli olduktan sonra bu yıl itibariyle, yanlışım varsa kendisi zaten düzeltir, Koç Üniversitesi Arkeoloji ve Sanat Tarihi bölümünde çalışmaya başladı. Sunumuna başlamadan önce Sayın Hodder'a birkaç soru sorarak kendisini tanımayanlar için de bir fırsat yaratmış olacağımızı düşünüyorum. Bugünkü etkinliğimiz tamamen simultane çevirmenimiz Karel Hanım tarafından, Karel Barbour tarafından Türkçe çevrilecektir. Ve kendisi benim de soruları Türkçe sormamı istedi. Onları da kendisi İngilizceye çevirecek. Öncelikle bir noktayı tekrar hatırlatmak istiyorum. Sayın Hodder'a sözü vermeden önce lütfen Türkçe dinlemek isteyenler Zoom ekranın altında sağ tarafta Türkçe seçeneğini seçmeleri gerekiyor. Evet, şimdi Sayın Hodder'a ilk sorumuzu sorabiliriz. Sayın Hodder, sanıyorum beni duyuyorsunuzdur.
Yes.
Ya, öncelikle izleyicilerimizin merakını gidermek açısından siz şu an Amerika Birleşik Devletleri'nde misiniz yoksa Türkiye'den mi katılıyorsunuz?
I'm in Turkey. I'm actually at Koç University itself.
Tamam, Koç Üniversitesi'nde çalışıyorsunuz. Arkeoloji ve sanat tarihi bölümünde. Kendinizi nasıl hissediyorsunuz? Yani aslında Türkiye'yi tanıyorsunuz. Türkiye'de bulunmak sizin için çok zor olmasa gerek.
No, I've been coming here for many years to Turkey, and it's really wonderful to be living here now. In the past, I just came for a few months every year, and always had to go back to either England or America. But now I'm settled here, and it's really wonderful to be living here in Istanbul.
Evet, ve uzun yıllar Konya'da da yaşadınız değil mi? Çatalhöyük'ün bulunduğu Konya'da da çok yıllar bulundunuz.
Yes, that's
Biliyor
right. I know many people think it's strange that I love Konya so much, but it has become a city that I very much remember with fond memories and happy times there, and we based all our research there, so it was it's a place that I got to know very well.
Evet, biliyor musunuz ben aslında Türkiye'de yaşamama rağmen Konya'ya belki bütün hayatım boyunca 1 ya da 2 kere gitmişimdir. Yani siz Türkiye'de benden çok daha fazla yıllar Konya'da bulundunuz. Peki ben şunu sormak istiyorum. Çatalhöyük önemli bir merkez, önemli bir yer. Hangi yıllar çalıştınız Çatalhöyük'te? Kaç yıllarında?
I started work there in 1993 and finished working doing the digging in 2017.
2017 yılından sonra Çatalhöyük'le ilgili bir çalışmanız şu an yok değil mi? Yani şunu merak ediyorum. Başka bir öğren yerinde, başka bir arkeolojik merkezde bir çalışmanız var mı? Yoksa daha ziyade kütüphane çalışmaları ya da başka arkeolojik konularda mı çalışıyorsunuz? Yani Çatalhöyük dışındaki hayatınız nasıl geçiyor?
Well, although we finished digging in 2017, there is still a huge amount of data that needs to be worked on and written about. So at the moment, I'm publishing 4 monographs about Çatalhöyük and also writing a new book about Çatalhöyük. So I have a lot of writing to do before I can say that I've really finished my work there.
Evet, peki o zaman ben sözü fazla uzatmak istemiyorum. Çünkü izleyicilerimiz hem sizi hem Çatalhöyük'ü çok merak ediyorlar. İsterseniz ekran paylaşımını yapabilirsiniz şimdi. Biz doğrudan sizin sunumunuzu dinlemek isteriz. Evet, gayet güzel. Ben sözü size bırakıyorum. Teşekkür ediyorum.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction. Very pleasant introduction, Hose, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk. And it's wonderful to have such a large audience to interact with, and I look forward to questions at the end. So, Çatalhöyük, which, as we were saying, is near Konya in central Turkey, was first excavated by James Mellart in the 1960s. And he made the site very famous by uncovering some extraordinary buildings with paintings and sculptures. And you can see some of those famous finds that he made here on this slide, especially this image in the middle that I'll come back to later on, but is often called the mother goddess of Çatalhöyük. But James Mellart got involved in a series of controversies in the mid-1960s, which led to the closure of Çatalhöyük. And he left in somewhat of a hurry. So there was a lot of erosion and loss of information that happened over the years that followed his departure. And you can see here some of the very sad destruction of the buildings and levels at Çatalhöyük. And this is what the site looked like when I arrived in 1993. So one of the main programs that we had, the main challenges, was to provide some proper infrastructure so that proper modern forensic scientific research could be carried out at the site. And so what you're seeing here is what we call the dig house, which actually consists of accommodation for over 100 people and about 12 laboratories and a visitor center. And on that basis, we lived in the dig house, which is just shown here. There are two mounds at Çatalhöyük. This is the main east mound, and we also did some digging on the west mound, which is a Chalcolithic site. But on the east mound, we dug here in the southern area, which is also where Mellart had excavated, and also in this northern area. So I will talk about the south and the north areas. This is a view of the excavations in the north area, where we built this shelter to protect the excavations and the buildings that we were finding. And this is a view of the excavations in the south area, where we were able to continue Mellart's excavations and go down to the bottom of Çatalhöyük. And in this period of time from 1993 to 2017, really we witnessed a lot of big revolutions in the nature of archaeology itself. So when we started digging, we were digging with a very small team, as you can see at the top. But by the end of the project, we had many hundreds of people working with us in a very large international and interdisciplinary project. And that's one of the changes that's really taken place in archaeology, is the interdisciplinary nature, the huge amounts of different types of scientific research that are now possible on archaeological sites. And I'll tell you a bit about some of those, including ancient DNA research. So the team got very much bigger and more specialized and scientific. And one aspect of this is that during the time of our excavations, we shifted from recording everything on paper, which people have been doing for decades or centuries, to recording entirely digitally, using tablets in the field and using a range of softwares that allowed us to investigate the three-dimensional nature and visual three-dimensional nature of the site. And you can see some of that activity at the bottom part of this slide. And I'm very happy to answer questions at the end about the methods, but I thought that I would concentrate in this talk on a series of questions that all have been important topics that the team has dealt with and about which there has been quite a lot of debate in the literature and in the media. And so these questions are shown here about the landscape and the environment, how people were buried, the nature of the houses And what I will concentrate on is social organization. How was this society organized? We think that perhaps up to 8,000 people may have lived at Çatalhöyük on this eastern mound. And they lived there for over 1,000 years, from about 7,100 to 6,000 before the Common Era. So how were they able to be so organized and so successful? How was it possible to organize so many people over such a long period of time? So how was society organized? And then finally, I will finish by saying a little bit about one of the most commonly discussed topics at Çatalhöyük, which is the role of female figurines and of women. But underlying all of these questions and topics is, I guess, the big question, the big topic, which is about social and human evolution. It has for a long time been the case that archaeologists and prehistorians and anthropologists have argued that societies develop from simple to complex, that we started off as simple hunter-gatherers, then we started having farming, but we remained very simple in terms of the political and social organization. But then with the development of urban contexts and cities and empires, we began to get much more complex. And of course, the world today is extremely complex. So that used to be the sort of story that we told, a sort of evolutionary story going from simple to complex. But a number of people have started saying, and I'm quite sympathetic to this, that this is a misunderstanding of what happened. That in fact, societies have always been complex, and that Çatalhöyük is an example of one of these very early, very complex societies. And I want to try and show to you how complex it was at this very early date, 9,000 years ago. So let's go to this first question before I return to this much broader question of social evolution. So one of the sort of, some of the puzzles, if you like, some of the puzzles of Çatalhöyük is how was it possible for perhaps 8,000 people at one point in time to live together in close proximity? And how did they manage to do that? What was the environment? What were the resources that allowed that sort of concentration of people? For hundreds of thousands of years before the Neolithic, people had lived in small bands of 30 to 50 people for the most part. Why did they all suddenly come together in the Neolithic to create these much larger communities? And how was that resourced? So one of the things that's become clear in our work at Çatalhöyük is that there was a wet land around the site, but it wasn't actually very much like in this picture. This is one theory that has been put forward by some of the people working at Çatalhöyük. But another theory, which I think is probably more correct, is that Çatalhöyük grew up and was surrounded by lots of small streams like this, or like this. So this is through time. You get this branching stream, the river Çarşamba, breaking up into lots of small little rivulets. And here's Çatalhöyük growing up, and then the West Mound growing up beside it. These lots of little rivulets. So this creates a very, very complex environment with lots of mosaics of different types of plants and different types of environments for different types of animals. Partly woodland, partly open, partly boggy, partly dry. And this allowed, therefore, a great diversity of resources which could be used. And these were also resources that were renewed annually as the river brought down floods that created more alluvium in the area around Çatalhöyük. So at least in the 7th millennium before the Common Era, from 7,000 to 6,000 BCE, at least during that period, this was a fairly wet, very rich environment that would have supported quite a lot of people. One of the intriguing questions about Çatalhöyük is that houses were packed very tightly together so that you had to walk around on the roofs of houses and go into the houses down ladders. And yet more intriguing is that inside these rooms, they had the dead buried beneath the floors. So when James Mellart excavated the site in the 1960s, he interpreted these burials beneath the floors in terms of some of the art imagery, which you can see here, that appears to show headless human bodies and vultures. These big birds are interpreted as vultures. And the idea is that these paintings show vultures taking the flesh off dead bodies. And so when Mellart found these jumble of bones underneath the floors, he interpreted this in terms of the residues, the remains of bodies that have been pecked by vultures. However, when we started to do our work using modern forensic, very detailed recording and analysis and chemical analysis of various sorts, we realized that most of the bodies had been put in the ground with their flesh on, and that there were no signs that vultures had been pecking the bones. And in fact, the jumble of bones that you see beneath the floor is not a result of dumping lots of bodies in that have been disturbed by vultures, but this is the result of putting one body in, as you can see here, and then digging another grave to put another body in, and another grave to put another body in, then filling the grave up, and then putting another body in, and then filling that grave up and putting another body in. But this is one platform in the house. And you can see all these bodies that have been placed in, sometimes on their own, sometimes it looks like a jumble, but is in fact the result of adding in more and more bodies over time. So we now think that bodies were put in fleshed, although at times they were disturbed in order to remove the heads. Not everybody was treated in this way, but we think special individuals were treated in this way. And you can see here there's a body with the head missing. And in this grave, we found the skeleton of a woman, and she is holding to her own face the skull of another woman. And you can see that that skull has been plastered and then painted in red in order to recreate the features of the dead person. So when that person died, the head was removed, the facial features were recreated in clay, and then the face was painted, and that was done several times, so that skull was kept for a long period of time and replastered and repainted before it was put back in this grave with this woman. So we do think that if you went to Çatalhöyük and you visited houses, you would see human skulls quite commonly in houses, kept and then reburied. But the work that the Human Remains team has done at Çatalhöyük has found that although it's true that the bodies were placed in the ground with their flesh on, they were also very often desiccated through a process of what they call delayed burial. So that after somebody died, they were not buried immediately, but their bodies were probably smoked above a fire or just dried in the sun, so that there was still skin and sinew on the body, but that it was much easier to put the body into a very tight position, to put them in these small graves. And then sometimes the head would be removed, as you can see again here in this grave here, there is no head. But in other cases, there is no arm or no legs. And so people would delay the burial, smoke or dry the body, put it in the ground, and then move heads or move body parts, so that when you visited Çatalhöyük and went in the houses, you would not only see skulls that had been kept of the ancestors, but also body parts and perhaps whole skeletons sitting in the corner of the houses, waiting to be buried. So that's how we now understand the burial practice at Çatalhöyük. What about how the houses were used themselves? We've been looking here at these burials beneath the platforms in the houses. And these always occur on the north or the eastern side of the house. And you come down a ladder from the roof on the southern side of the house, which is where the hearths and the ovens are. So when Neler excavated these houses, he thought that they were very special buildings of some sort of priestly elite, some sort of hierarchical social system where you had elite priestly people who organized and controlled society. And this sort of argument makes it easier to understand how the society was organized, because you had hierarchy and centralization justified by some sort of religious practices. So he thought that at least some of the houses were what he called shrines, and that these were separate from domestic houses. But again, our very detailed forensic work, where we do what's called micromorphology, which means taking thin sections through the walls and floors of houses and looking under the microscope at the micro residues of what was left behind. When we do that, what we find is that there is actually a lot of evidence of daily practice and domestic use in all of the buildings. The trouble had been that when people left Çatalhöyük, when they left every building and built another building on top of it, that they cleaned out the house very carefully. And so you don't usually find artifacts that are visible left on the floors. And so the only way we can really find out what people were doing in these buildings is by looking at the micro residues and the chemicals that were left behind by people's activities. And when we do that, we find it's clear that these houses were all lived in, that there were not shrines on the one hand and domestic houses on the other hand, but that all houses were domestic lived-in houses, and some of them have more symbolism than others. So that if you went into a house at Çatalhöyük, it would look a bit like this. You're looking here at the north and the eastern part. This is where we're looking now towards the southern part with the ladder coming from the roof, where you have the hearths and ovens, and where people did all their daily life, their making of tools, their cooking of food, and making of clothes and so on, all those daily activities in the south part of the house. And in the northern part, as you move northwards, you've got these bull horns on the walls and these strange figures on the walls, a very, very different type of more ritual type of activity with the burials beneath the platforms in the northern and eastern parts of the rooms. So we think that all houses at Çatalhöyük integrated the religious and the social and the domestic and the productive all together. So if it was not the case then that we find sort of separate houses of elite priests or some sort of ruling class at Çatalhöyük, how was it possible to organize such a large community? And as I said before, this is the thing that I want to focus on most, because I think in the way it's most fascinating in terms of understanding the real complexity of Çatalhöyük. So when Mellart found these types of buildings with very elaborate symbolism in them, he also found that at times they were rebuilt in the same location with very similar symbolism. So for example, here, this is the north wall of a building excavated by Mellart. And you see what he interpreted as two animals, which he thought were leopards because they're spotted, two leopards facing each other on the wall. So after about 50 or so years, which is normal at Çatalhöyük, the upper part of the house was knocked down and the lower part was filled in, and a new house was built on top. And this is the house that was built on top of this one. And this is again the north wall. And you can see again a pair of leopards with spots looking at each other. So this suggests that this house here and its elaborate symbolism continued on through time. And we see the same sort of thing in other parts of the site, that there are some buildings which last for a long time and have quite elaborate symbolism in them. And we have found the same thing. So this is a building here where you've got two bull's horns on pedestals around a burial platform. Underneath here, we found lots of people buried. There's this actually a young cow's skull on the wall. And later we found lots of paintings on this wall. So this is a really very elaborate platform in a very elaborate house. And down here you can see another house with a big bull's horns on the wall and bull's horns here along a bench. So really quite elaborate buildings. And again, when we look at these over time, we find that these very elaborate buildings are often replaced over many, many generations, perhaps over 500 years, the same building replaced in the same position over and over again. Other houses are often also repeated, but not to such a degree and with not the same amount of elaborate symbolism. And also what we find is that these more elaborate buildings with more symbolism in, which last for longer periods of time, are also the buildings that have most burials. So what I'm showing you here is a graph where each of these dots is a house. And we're looking at the elaboration, how elaborate the house is, from the least elaborate house here to the most elaborate house here. And this is the amount of burials, from no burials in the house to over 60 burials. And you can see there is a correlation between the number of burials and the elaboration of the house. So it does seem to be the case that although we cannot talk about separate shrines and priestly elites, we can talk about some buildings being more elaborate than others and being places where you buried the dead. If you can imagine a house that existed for about 50 years, in one of these houses we found over 60 people buried. And it's impossible for a small family group to produce 60 dead people within such a short period of time. So we think that these more elaborate houses were also the places where people were buried. People preferred to bury their dead in these very elaborate houses. But where were these houses in the settlement? They don't seem to have been in one particular area, but they seem to be spread all about, all over the site. And when we look at them on the map, we find they're scattered all over in a sort of fairly random way. But they seem to be surrounded by small neighborhoods. And so, for example, here, this is in one of the phases of occupation at Çatalhöyük. You've got a group of buildings here who all have very distinctive characteristics. For example, the burials have red deer canine beads, and the animals have animal scat. The burials have animal scat, animal feces placed on them. So these are very peculiar characteristics that are not found in most houses, but they are found in this particular group of houses. So we talk about this as a neighborhood, a small neighborhood, a cluster of houses, which includes a very elaborate building, this one here, but the other ones are less elaborate. So there seem to be these little neighborhoods clustered around these elaborate buildings, and perhaps these little neighborhoods are somehow affiliated to that building. But it's actually more complicated than that. Here is a map that shows another example here of 3 buildings that through time have distinctive characteristics that we can call a neighborhood house group. But we can also see there are other types of grouping. I don't know how clearly you can see this, but this is a dotted line that goes along the abutments, the joining together of houses. Sorry. So the houses on this side end on this line, and the houses on this side end on this line, and so on. You can just sort of see it going through here, and a line of walls abutting each other all the way down here. And there's another one of these over here. Can you just see the wall lines underneath this dotted line? And another one over here. There seem to be these wedges where we again find cultural distinctive things in them, suggesting these are social groups of some sort. And then these wedges are themselves located within much larger groupings, which are defined by zones of rubbish. So there are no houses all the way along here. So this is a zone, an empty zone, which separates all these buildings over here from all the buildings over on this side. And the new work that is being undertaken by Ali Turkcan at Çatalhöyük, the new director of the new excavations there that started very recently, they have been finding evidence to support this idea of neighborhoods. So you have these neighborhoods within within wedges, within sectors, and then there are 2 mounds on the east mound at Çatalhöyük, two hills, if you like, and that suggests a division of the site into 2 halves. So there is some sort of complicated way within which every house is in a neighborhood, but is also in these other types of nested groupings. So that may already seem complicated, but I want to say that it's even more complicated than that. So we're looking here at a reconstruction, a visual reconstruction of some of the houses at Çatalhöyük at one level of occupation. And I'm going to look at this house here. And the western wall of this building was eroded away when Neler left the excavations, but it would have gone along here somewhere. And so you would have come down the ladder here in the southeast corner of the building, come onto this platform, and the oven is underneath the platform. Then you walk northwards across this bench, which at one point had bull's horns here, onto these platforms that have burials. And you can see the beautiful white walls here and where the posts were that held up the walls. But I want to point out to you that here there is a painting. You can't see it very well here, but you can see it being reconstructed or uncovered, being uncovered here, because all the paintings were covered over in the Neolithic by adding layers of white above them. So we have to take off the layers of white to get at the painting. And here you can see what that painting looked like. And you see that it has uprights or upright vertical lines. Some are missing vertical lines, and then triangles that are attached to the vertical lines. And then this brick pattern. It looks like a series of bricks that are in these, that are between the triangles. So I want you to try and remember that. And then to look at this other house painting, which also has vertical lines and triangles and a brick design. And you might have thought that these two houses would be close to each other in a neighborhood. But in fact, they're as far away from each other as you can get in this excavation area. And we find lots and lots of this type of jumping across distances. It seems clear that as well as these neighborhood and sector and wedge groupings, people also had very complex cross-cutting networks with other houses across the settlement as a whole. And I tried to show this by this sort of diagram. The idea here is that any house in the middle here, if you take any house at Çatalhöyük, it would be within a neighborhood, which would be within a radial wedge, which would be within a sector, which would be within a submound, within a mound. So the whole site was segmented in this way. But across cutting these would be things like the bear sodality or bear society or the leopard society. I'm saying this because the houses with leopards in are scattered all across the site. They're not in the same area, suggesting that there was some connection between houses with leopards across the site as a whole. I also think that people were buried into houses not from the neighborhood, but from other areas. And I'm going to talk in a little bit about this question of burial and biological kin, because that's a very interesting aspect that really surprised everybody about Çatalhöyük and upset a lot of our assumptions about not only Çatalhöyük, but other sites in the Neolithic in the Middle East. We had always assumed that the people who lived in the houses at Çatalhöyük were some sort of nuclear family, by which I mean you might have, a grandparent, then some parents, and then some children. Perhaps, 4 to 8 people in what we call a nuclear family. When we first worked at Çatalhöyük, the bones were so badly preserved, the human bones were so badly preserved, that we were not able to get ancient DNA from them. And so we did a study of teeth, a very careful measuring of teeth. And there are some aspects of your shape of your teeth which are passed down genetically from your parents. And when people used, when our team used these teeth measurements as a proxy, as a way of showing genetic closeness between people, they found that the people were not buried in the same house. So what I'm saying here is that if you look at the teeth measurements, you find that these two individuals, two human skulls, are very similar to each other, but they're not in the same house. And the same is through all of this, all these together, very similar, but they're not in the same house. So what's going on here? Well, how is it possible for this to be happening? Well, we wanted to check that this was a real pattern. And more recently, with the great advances in the ability to measure ancient DNA, Mehmet Somel and his team from ODTÜ have been able to do wonderful work looking at the relationships between people that were buried in the same house using ancient DNA. And what this shows is that if you look at the people buried in the same house at Çatalhöyük, most of the people buried are not relatives with each other. There are a few that are relatives, but most of the people are not relatives. This is true of some other sites, but it's not true of other ones. So at Çatalhöyük, you have a very marked pattern whereby people who are buried beneath the floor were not the nuclear family. They were not close relatives. So there are a number of ways that we can interpret this. My own interpretation is that fairly soon after birth, children were taken from their biological parents and were brought up in the houses of other people across the settlement. And what this does is it means that any one individual has parents that are biological, but also has parents that they grew up with in a house. And so really what it does is it creates the whole of Çatalhöyük as one genetically mixed up family. So you might even not know perhaps who were your biological parents. And the end result is very, very strong connections between everybody across this whole settlement. It's a remarkable way of using using biology to create community. It stops the way, it prevents individual families from creating wealth that they pass down to their biological children. It forces a dispersal of connections through the whole of the community. So in talking of the social organization at Çatalhöyük, I think that we have to see, well, I would like to see Çatalhöyük as an enormously complicated society where there were no real leaders. There were communities that centered around elders who lived in buildings in which people were buried. But there were a huge amount of cross-cutting relationships. And it must have been just very, very difficult to learn all this at Çatalhöyük, to work out who was related to who and to sort of sort out the exchange relationships and the social relationships and the historical relationships through time, what had happened here over the past centuries. So and also into all that, we have to add the working together in terms of fields and looking after animals and exchanging with other communities. So in my view, this is perhaps a society which is more complex than our own in certain ways. And that it becomes very difficult to say in a simple way, we've gone from simple to complex. Rather, what's happened is we've gone from complex to different types of complexity over time. So I want to end by it would be wrong to give a talk about Çatalhöyük and not to talk about this image, which is has pride of place in the Anatolian Civilizations Museum in Ankara as an important image from Çatalhöyük that is often talked about as the mother goddess, who is seen as sitting on a throne of what are often talked about as leopards, with her hands, which are lost here, but with her hands resting on the heads of the leopards and with their tails coming up over her shoulders from the back. So this appears to be a powerful woman in control of nature. And as a result, this image has been used by goddess worshippers across the world. And we have always had groups of women on mother goddess or goddess tours who come to see Çatalhöyük and to feel the spirituality of the site in terms of this goddess presence. So what is the actual evidence about the role of women and of these female figurines at Çatalhöyük? It's certainly the case that Neler in the 1960s found a rather charming group of clay figurines sitting and naked. And it was very easy for him and others to see these as the mother goddess. But in our work, the new team has looked at these images very carefully and has decided that they're not really images of young women about to give birth, or they're not really images of fertility as such, but rather they're older women after they've given birth with sagging breasts and sagging stomachs and sagging bottoms, that these are older women. The original idea had been that the mother goddess was a symbol of fertility that was important in the early development of farming, with creating fertile soils and increasing populations, so that fertility was important. But when we looked more closely, it seemed that you got more a question of older women with sagging stomachs and so on. And when we have done a chemical analysis, actually isotopic analysis of the human remains at Çatalhöyük, we find that there is a difference between the diets of older people and younger people. So on this diagram, the filled in symbols are older people and the open symbols are younger people. And you can see that the younger people are mainly over here and the older people are mainly over here, suggesting that the older people have a different diet. And there are actually a number of ways in which we think that we can show that there was a great respect paid to age at Çatalhöyük, and that these figurines are mainly representing elders who had obtained some social significance. But these older people, and indeed the younger people, are both men and women. And we have found no evidence that men and women led very different lives at Çatalhöyük. It was more that all older people had status, not that older men or older women had status, but all older people. In terms of the men and women, their diets were the same. They were eating the same things. They were doing similar work. If you look at their bodies, you can see that they are being used in very similar ways. Their arms and their legs, their feet were being used in very similar ways. They seem to have lived very similar lives, men and women. And also, I showed you before how the removal of heads was a very important aspect of life at Çatalhöyük once you died. So the removal of heads was a sign of some sort of status of a person. And again, both men and women have their heads removed, and both men and women are treated very similarly in burial. So overall, we look again and again and again, and we find that men and women live very similar lives. It's certainly true. There are these wonderful images of what people tend to interpret as women. And I really love this figurine because it's almost as if you can see the individuality of this face. It just seems a very real person. Of course, there are no actual genitalia shown on this. So we could argue that this was an image of a sumo wrestler type of man. But on the whole, most people would see these as female figurines. And they do seem to become more important at the end of the life of Çatalhöyük. So these beautiful images occur really in the last few levels, the last few decades of the occupation at Çatalhöyük. Through most of the time at Çatalhöyük, we don't really see a clear separation between men and women in terms of any sort of imagery. But also at the end, it is not the case that we only find women. We also find an increase in male figurines, and these are shown. This is a bearded image here of some sort of male figurine. And in a lot of the paintings in these later levels, you can see bearded individuals and the animals all have erect penises. So this suggests a very male aspect of life. So it's very difficult to argue that Çatalhöyük was run by some sort of matriarchy or by some group of women that controlled society. We just don't see that. What we see is that towards the end of Çatalhöyük, that both men and women come to be shown in these beautiful figurines and in these paintings. In fact, we can now begin to turn around the original idea that you start off in the Neolithic with a focus on women, and then later on you get a focus on men, because of other work that's been taking place on earlier sites in the southeast of Turkey. I'm sure many of you will know about the site of Göbekli Tepe in southeast Anatolia, which is well before Çatalhöyük, in a society which is to some extent hunter-gatherer. And here in these early settled villages, you see not a focus on women and fertility, but a focus on males and erect penises, as you can see in this example here. And then also this remarkable ritual center at Karahan Tepe, being excavated by Necmi Karul, where all of these uprights, I don't know if you can see it very clearly, but all of these uprights look as if they're phalluses, penises. So in fact, the older story, which said that you start off with settled life and early farming in terms of a female-centered iconography, and then it becomes male-centered later on. The opposite, in fact, seems to be true, that you have a very, very masculine, very male-centered activity right at the beginning of the formation of settled villages and early agriculture. And it's only towards the end of Çatalhöyük that you get these wonderful figurines of women. But as I said before, they're also balanced by images of men. So I hope that gives you some insight into the complexity of not only the social organization of Çatalhöyük, but also of the relations of men and women, and of the way families were organized at Çatalhöyük. These are some of the people that supported us as we worked over those 25 years, to which I'm enormously grateful. And I would very much welcome and look forward to questions in the next part of this presentation. Thank you very much.
Evet, biz teşekkür ediyoruz Ian Hodder'a. Gerçekten çok güzel, çok verimli bir konuşmaydı. Çok faydalandık. Şimdi saat şu an 8'i geçiyor, yani 1 saati doldurduk. Dilerseniz hemen sorulara geçeyim. İzleyicilerimiz tabii çok fazla soru sordular ama biz bu toplantıyı 1,5 saat içinde tamamlamak zorundayız. Bu nedenle bazı soruları okumazsam kusura bakmasın izleyicilerimiz ve mümkün olduğu takdirde de bir konuşmacının bir sorusunu sormak isteyeceğim. Çünkü aynı konuşmacı birkaç kez sorarsa diğerlerine vakit kalmayabilir. Evet, ben şimdi chat kısmını açıyorum. Oradan sorular geldi. Bilmiyorum konuşmacımız Ian Hodder görüyor mu? Ben önce kendi bir görüntümü de kapatayım müsaade ederseniz daha rahat olmak için. Şimdi önce çok teşekkürler var. Çok verimli bulmuşlar konuşmayı. Onu söyleyebilirim. Evet. Cem Şeref Bediz'in bir sorusu var. Karar Hanım, siz onu çevirebilirsiniz. Ben okuyacağım ama siz de okuyabilirsiniz belki. Ben o zaman yavaş okuyayım. Sayın Hodder, Çatalhöyük'te emeğiniz çok büyük. Evet, şu soru. Çatalhöyük yaşamı ve bugün orada yaşayanların benzerlikleri var mıdır diye soruyor. Yani eski Çatalhöyük'le bugünkü o bölgede yaşayan insanlar arasında bir bağ var mı? Kısa olursa cevaplarda çok sevinirim.
That's a very interesting question. It depends really what you mean by life. There are certainly aspects of life that are very similar. For example, we have learned a lot about the buildings of Çatalhöyük houses by studying the modern mud brick houses in the villages around Çatalhöyük, and the types of ovens and internal storage bins and things like that you find inside the modern houses are very similar in many ways to the houses we found at Çatalhöyük. But in terms of the belief system and the social organization, I think it was an utterly different world. Çatalhöyük was still a society in which hunting was remembered and valued very highly. These are farmers, but they're still very much involved in a symbolic world, which is about wild bulls and wild deer and wild boar and so on, bears and leopards. That they lived in a symbolic world that was very, very different from the one that we live in today.
Tamam, çok teşekkür ederim. Küçük bir soru daha. Alpcan Özden sormuş. Orada bu insanların konuştuğu dille ilgili herhangi bir veri var mı? Yani o dil o dönem için neye benziyor? Hangi kültürlerle ilişkili?
So of course Çatalhöyük, starting at 7000 BCE, is many thousands of years before the first language, the first written language. And so we have no idea what people at Çatalhöyük were speaking. There is a theory that when the first farmers came through from places like Göbekli Tepe into central Anatolia and into Europe, that they spoke the origin of an Indo-European language, so that it was something similar to an Indo-European language. But that hypothesis, I think, has been largely discredited now. And so we're left back with really having no idea about what the language was. We have no idea what the name of the people was. This is all much too long before writing.
Teşekkür ederim. Dilara Aktaş, evlerin duvarlarında sık sık resmedilen boğa figürü neyi sembolize ediyor?
So I was saying before that the symbolic world of the people at Çatalhöyük was very different from our own, and in many of these types of societies that are known ethnographically, the world of animals is not simply seen as a resource that you hunt in order to get food, but the animals are seen as having spiritual power, and that when you kill an animal, you have to apologize and you have to do various rituals to apologize for the killing. And we think that when people brought in these wild animal heads into Çatalhöyük, this wasn't just to show off, oh, you know, I'm a great hunter. And it wasn't just that, although it was partly that, undoubtedly. But it was also to take the power, the spiritual power of the bull and bring it into the house, to animate the house, to make the house alive, to make it powerful, to make it able to look after the ancestors and so on. I hope that gives you some idea how to answer that question.
Teşekkür ederim tekrar. Korkut Akın şöyle bir soru sormuş. Çatalhöyük'teki DNA analizleri, yapılan analizler Akdeniz kıyısındaki ülke halklarıyla bir bağlantı, DNA bağlantısı olduğunu gösteriyor. Yani Çatalhöyük ve Akdeniz ülkelerindeki DNA bağlantısı var. Peki Orta Asya ile bir bağ var mı? Vakti zamanında Korkut Bey dinlemiş Sayın Hodder'ı ve öyle bir bulgu yokmuş. Acaba yeni bir tespit, farklı bir görüş var mı diye soruyor.
So, as you know, the interpretation of these ancient DNA results is always complicated. But there are sites earlier than Çatalhöyük in the Konya Plain, sites like Boncukluhöyük, and in central Anatolia. These, the genetic evidence, the ancient DNA shows that most of the people at Çatalhöyük are local people. So what happened at Çatalhöyük was that lots of separate villages or small settlements came together and formed Çatalhöyük. So most of the people at Çatalhöyük are local people, but in origin, they have connections undoubtedly with the Near East, with the Middle East. I do not myself believe that there is any evidence of direct contact with Central Asia. There is undoubtedly contact between the Middle East and Central Asia, but not with Çatalhöyük.
Teşekkür ederim. Bülent Tandoğan Çatalhöyük'ü ziyaret ettiğinde etrafta pek çok başka höyükler de varmış. Sorusu şu: civarda, yani Çatalhöyük'ün dışında Çatalhöyük'ten daha önemli başka höyükler olabilir mi? Bunlarla Çatalhöyük arasında ne gibi ilişkiler vardır? Bu araştırıldı mı?
So when I first came to Turkey, I did not think it was possible to dig Çatalhöyük. And so I looked for another site like Çatalhöyük, or even more important than Çatalhöyük. But I could not find one. And many people have done research, doing surveys in the Konya Plain and around, looking for other sites like Çatalhöyük. But as I said before, the population of the Konya Plain seems to have all come into Çatalhöyük, and they stayed there. And there were no other sites in the Konya Plain during Çatalhöyük. And then after Çatalhöyük, there are many sites again. So the population came in and then it went out again. So there are lots of mounds around Çatalhöyük in the Konya Plain, but they're mostly later. There are some earlier than Çatalhöyük, but they're mostly later, Chalcolithic, and then later Bronze Age and Iron Age and so on.
Teşekkür ederim. Bülent Tandoğan'ın bir sorusu daha var. Çatalhöyük'te James Mellart'ın bulduğu Hasan Dağı ve Çatalhöyük evlerini gösteren, betimleyen duvar resmi gerçek mi? Çünkü diyor Hasan Dağı'nın Çatalhöyük'ten görülmesi çok zor. Acaba gezgin bir ressam mı yaptı?
Yes, when I first worked at Çatalhöyük, you could on a clear day see Hasan Dağı, just in the distance you could just see it. But nowadays, because of modern agriculture, there is a haze everywhere, and you can't see it anymore. But my own view is that that Mellart had a very vivid imagination, and that that painting does not show an exploding volcano. I think it shows a leopard skin and a geometric design. I don't think it shows a volcano and a city beneath it. But these things are very difficult to interpret, and maybe Mellart was right, but I don't think so.
Teşekkür ederim. Oktay Kaynak sormuş. Çatalhöyük'te yaşayanlar ölülerini niçin dışarıda bir yere değil de evlerinin zeminine gömme gereği duymuşlar?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question to answer. I know it seems very strange to us, although perhaps it's not so strange. I remember that my grandmother had the ashes of her grandmother in a pot that she kept on the mantelpiece, above the fire. She would keep it there, and I think that was quite a common practice in Victorian England, was to keep the ashes of the dead in the house. So I'm not sure that it's so strange, but certainly ethnographically, there are quite a lot of societies around the world where people bury the dead beneath the floor, and the reason is usually that it's the ancestors that create continuity and lineage. And you remember I said that it was important to have the spirits of the bull in the house to animate the house and to look after it. And I think that ancestors were also thought to look after the house, to make it alive. I told you that perhaps, well, certainly the skulls and perhaps the whole bodies of the dead were kept in the houses. And so it may be that when you went to dinner at Çatalhöyük, you had the dead ancestor also at the table. There are many societies in the world, well, not many, but there are societies in the world ethnographically that do this sort of thing. So there was the idea was that you had to continue that ancestral line. You still, you valued the older people, but you also valued the dead people. And in order for the society to go on being able to reproduce and be successful, you needed the old people there to help you, their presence. So it perhaps difficult for us to understand, but I do think that it's something like that.
Teşekkür ederim. Teşekkür ederim. İbrahim Hızalan, burada Çatalhöyük'te pişirilen yemekler, pişirme, yemek yeme konusunda bir şeyler söyleyebilir mi? Yani mutfakla ilgili bir şey söyleyebilir mi? Soru.
Yes, that's a great question, because archaeologists tend to be rather unimaginative. You know, they say people were they had 50% of emmer wheat and 20% of barley and 10% of sheep bones and things like that. They don't really put it together as a cuisine, but we have had some of my team have done that and written articles about the cuisine at Çatalhöyük, and it's very, very interesting because sometimes we find the seeds and the bones in particular connections, or we can look at the residues in the pottery and talk about what was cooked in the pots. Anyway, so an example is that we found a collection which seems to have been used as a way of putting flavor into food, and it was a mixture of peas and of small fish. So in these little rivers around Çatalhöyük, there were small fish, and they seem to have made some sort of strange meal out of peas and fish, and they would keep it there, and then they would take bits out of it and add it perhaps onto bread, or they had bread, but then they gave up on bread. They decided they didn't like bread, and they started using gruel, you know, eating cereals as a gruel. I don't know if you can translate that, but Carol, it's a sort of porridge, I suppose, a porridge, a wet cereal thing. So that's an example of, you know, and of course they had lots of wonderful berries and honey to make things sweet, but very, very elaborate cuisine, I think, with lots and they had about 120 different types of seeds, mostly wild seeds that they collected and made different mixtures from. Yeah, very elaborate cuisine.
Teşekkür ederim. Füsun Tülek, ev halkı, hane halkı ilişkileri, yani kimlerden oluşuyordu? Bir evin içinde nasıl bir araya geliyorlardı?
Well, I think it's partly a matter of ancestry. You know, that some of the people in the house would be the children of the people who lived there before them, or in the house beneath. You know, so you might have a house people lived in, and then they build another house on top. And the people living in the house on top, some of them were related to the people who lived in the house underneath. The other people who lived in the house were from the neighborhood, the local neighborhood. And these might not actually sleep in the house, but they would come and go. And we know that they ate together. So we have evidence that all the people who were buried in the house also ate together. So you have a group of people who are probably very mixed. You know, I doubt it was very stable like it is in our society so much. But you would have some people who are from the ancestors, some people who are from the neighborhood, some people who were the people that you ate with together, and then there were other people who came to live in the house from childhood, from different parents, and so it would be a real mixture of people that probably changed every day. It was very, very fluid and very flexible, and that's one of the ways that you have such a large number of people that can live together. They're all sort of moving around all the time, and very, very different from the way we see ourselves. You know, we nowadays we have these very distinct. I mean, Turkey is different from England, but in England you have very distinct family entities living in their own houses and separate from each other. I think it was very different at Çatalhöyük.
Teşekkür ederim. Son 5 dakikamız kaldığı için bazı soruları geçiyorum. Işık, kısaca Çatalhöyük'ün son sakinleri nereye gitti? Buna dair bir bulgu var mı? Yani Çatalhöyük'teki son yerleşim nasıl son buldu? Nereye gittiler?
Yes. So briefly, towards the end of Çatalhöyük, the community started changing in many different ways and started breaking up. And the picture I've been talking to you about sort of ended, and you get population dispersing into other mounds on the Konya Plain, and starting what's called the Chalcolithic period. But many people now say that people from Çatalhöyük or from that part of Turkey were the origin of the people that then spread, taking farming into Europe. And so towards the end of the 7th millennium BCE, Çatalhöyük dispersed, broke up, and quite a lot of people contributed to the movement of people into northwest Anatolia and into Central Europe.
Evet, teşekkür ediyorum. Evet, yaşlılık, Çatalhöyük'te yaşlılık denildiği zaman kaç yaş anlaşılmalı? Yani belki bu bir insan ömrünü de belki düşünerek orada insanlar kaç yaşında ölüyorlardı?
Yes. Yes. So at Çatalhöyük, a lot of people died very early. So there's a very high infant mortality. And we also have evidence of women dying in childbirth. So childbirth and early life were very difficult. But if you manage to get, to 10, 15 years old, in fact, it was a very healthy population, and people live to 60, 70 years old.
Evet, teşekkür ederim. Evet, bir saniye. Özür diliyorum, bir saniye. Çünkü benzer sorular sorulmuş. Evet. Özellikle Ayşegül Özkan soruyor. Çatalhöyük ile Karahantepe ve Göbeklitepe, burada bulunanlar, bu çalışmalar yorumları değiştirdi mi? Yani Çatalhöyük çok eski bir yerleşim, kazılıyor ama daha sonra Göbeklitepe ve Karahantepe'de de yeni bilgiler öğrenildi. Bu öğrenilen yeni bilgilerin Çatalhöyük'te bulunanlarla bir ilişkisi var mı? Nasıl yorumlanabilir?
Yes, I think Göbekli and Karahan and those other sites they change the story about early settled life and early farming because they're so early and so very, very complex. It's another way that we can say the old evolutionary ideas of simple to complex don't work because you have these amazingly complicated sites at a very early date. There are many differences between those sites and Çatalhöyük. the most obvious one is that Çatalhöyük has domestic symbolism. It does not have any temples or ceremonial structures, whereas Göbekli and Karahan, you have these very amazing ceremonial structures. So, but on the other hand, and it's really, I don't understand it, it's very, very strange, but even though the sites are at least 2,000 years apart from Çatalhöyük, a lot of the symbolism is very similar. You have very similar emphasis on wild animals, but also the removal of heads and vultures and birds and animals sitting on either side of humans, and I mean just lots and lots of ways of showing continuity of the same symbolic system. So it seems that although there's been a lot of social and economic change between Göbekli and Çatal, that the mythology somehow carried on and was revived at Çatalhöyük.
Evet, çok teşekkür ediyorum. Çünkü saatimiz 8:30 oldu. Yani epey bir zaman sorulara ayırdık ve sorular bitmiyor. Gerçekten çok fazla soru var ama vaktimiz yok. Yani şu ana kadar 1/3 soruları ancak okuyabildim sizlere. Bu nedenle affınıza sığınarak burada soru cevap kısmını kesmek istiyorum. Ama Sayın Profesör artık Türkiye'de ve Koç Üniversitesi'nde kendisine bir kez daha hoş geldiniz diyorum. Umarım kendisiyle ileride ve çeşitli vesilelerle tekrar iletişim kurmanız mümkün olabilecektir. Sayın Hodder, çok çok teşekkür ediyorum size. Davetimizi kırmadınız, Ahmet'in davetini kırmadınız ve kabul ettiniz. Bu konuşma için tekrar teşekkür ediyorum. Umarım farklı konularda, farklı mecralarda tekrar sizinle birlikte olmayı umuyoruz.
Yes.
Çok teşekkür ederim.
Yes, I would like that very much, and thank you again. I'm very pleased to have had such a large and an interested audience who asked such a lot of really wonderful questions. I'm sorry we can't answer them. If you have urgent questions you'd like to ask me, do send me an email, either at my Koch email address or at my Stanford email address. You can easily find it online. But thank you again for inviting me. It's been a very pleasurable experience.
Evet, Kalel Hanım, size de çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Yani kelime hazneniz herhalde bayağı gelişmiştir. Çünkü arkeologların dahi bazen anlamakta zorlanacağı terimler vardı. Ama çok güzel bir şekilde bu çeviriyi bize sağladınız. Size de ayrıca çok teşekkür ediyorum. Değerli izleyiciler, hepinize hem iyi akşamlar hem de güzel bir hafta sonu diliyorum.